morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. My name is Alejandra Casillas from the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group, and I will be providing support for the meeting. Deb Levine is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes is the scribe, along with Bill Pettingill, who is listed as a panelist, is the coordinator overseeing all three of the active Edam working groups. Next slide, please. Before I go over meeting reminders, I just wanted to make you aware of a temporary adjustment that we made to the meeting schedule for the Edam working groups for the next 2 weeks. As shown on this slide, there will have one session per week for each working group over the next couple of weeks, and then return to our original meeting cadence of 2 meetings per week starting on February 14th. This update was communicated in a notice that was issued last Friday, but I'll let Milo Bosnak from ISO's policy group go into more detail.
Thank you, Ellie, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the working group. I wanted to just provide a bit more detail on a couple of these logistical announcements that we made over the last week, and I made similar announcements in the prior working groups this week. I won't go into it next week, but since there may be some different folks that are participating across working groups, I wanted to do the same overview that I've done in the other working groups as well today. But before jumping into those, I also, again, wanted to acknowledge and express our gratitude on behalf of the ISO for all the stakeholders that have been participating across all three of the working groups, including Working Group 2 that's going on today. And we certainly appreciate the robust participation across these working groups. We recognize that we've been moving fairly fast, 2 working group meetings per week, and we certainly appreciate the good discussions, the open dialogue, and the sharing of perspectives that's occurred today. As Ellie noted, we made a temporary adjustment to the working group schedule across all three of the working groups, and really the intent here is to be responsive to some stakeholder requests that we've heard, to allow really more time for stakeholders to vet topics, not only within their organizations, but also with other stakeholders now that we are starting to delve into really more meaty and more substantive elements across each one of the working groups. And so as a result, we'll be moving to a temporary decrease in the cadence from 2 meetings a week to 1 meeting a week to allow for those discussions to happen, for the forming of those perspectives, and really caucusing amongst stakeholders. We encourage stakeholders to meet, vet frameworks that they've heard to date, whether those were presented by the ISO across the working groups or whether those were presented by other stakeholders in the working groups. And if those discussions lead to refinements or to the frameworks or some additional perspectives, we encourage stakeholders to bring those back to their respective working groups. I think this is going to allow for continued progress once we return back to the normal cadence in the working groups, and allow stakeholders to be more readily able to engage and share some of the perspectives. Separately, I also wanted to note that last Friday we issued a market notice, or last Monday we issued a market notice where we scheduled monthly Edam working group debrief meetings that are scheduled for February 16th and I believe March 18th. And these are monthly meetings to really take stock of where we are across the working groups and the progress that we've made to date, what else remains, and where we're going in terms of topics for each one of the working groups. And also, I think, helps us identify interdependencies between working group topics that we've tackled to date. I think those monthly meetings are also an opportunity to allow stakeholders that maybe don't have the ability to participate across all three of the working groups. It should help also shape where we are in the process to date across all three of the topics. So we hope that these monthly meetings hopefully are not too burdensome, but they provide an additional opportunity for stakeholders to stay up to date on the Edam effort. And like I said, we published the market notice for that with the details on Monday, this past Monday. So with that, again, thank you everybody again for the robust engagement in these working groups, and we look forward to the continued discussions, and I'll turn it over back to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Miloš. Meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you. As a reminder, please state your name and affiliation first so that the rest of the group knows who's speaking. The working group meetings are recorded and video files will be posted on the corresponding working group web pages. Please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. Stakeholders are welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. If so, please submit a request to present using the Inquire link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated web page, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you help you engage in the Edam stakeholder process. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introductions, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Levine to discuss today's objectives, OATT and non-OATT rights. Then we will proceed with James Lynn, who will discuss transmission revenue distribution, and finally double close with the upcoming topic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb Levine.
Hey, Deb, your line is still muted.
Thank you. The dog was barking, so I put it on mute. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ellie. Originally today we were going to go through the examples, but we are still working on them. We want to make sure that we have a right mix of OAT versus non-OAT rights and incorporate in a number of the scenarios that were requested by the various stakeholders. So going through multiple Edam BAAs, imports and exports out of Edam BAAs, and the interaction with non-participating Edam BAAs. So I've gone ahead and moved that discussion to next Thursday, the 10th. So today what we'd like to do is go ahead and focus on the congestion rent compensation framework for bucket 2. In that instance, the OAT and non-OAT rights being transferred in bucket 2 are voluntarily done, and we'll review. James Lynn is online, and he'll go through his whole presentation about the different examples of cost allocation and for the transfer rights. And lastly, there's consideration of, we'll have part of the discussion, consideration of potential additional or different compensation frameworks for the OAT and non-OAT rights available underneath the Edam market for bucket 2. So all of that will start on today, and then go into back to the examples the following week. So with respect to OAT and non-OAT rights, what we're grappling with and are going to need to have additional discussion with the participants is how OAT and non-OAT rights are different and how they have different durations and how they can or cannot be made available to the market in either bucket 1 or bucket 2. The other thing we need to do is go ahead and determine how they're going to be utilized by the right holder if they are not self-scheduled in the day-ahead market. What happens if the entity decides that, let's say they have 100 megawatt OAT rights, they go ahead and they only schedule 70 megawatts in the day-ahead market, self-schedule it, source to sink. So that's perfect. We can go ahead and not charge the congestion charge, so they will be held harmless as far as financially is concerned. But when you change and all of a sudden go up to, let's say, at the 100 megawatts or 90 megawatts, a higher amount in the real time, if we've already dispatched that amount in the day-ahead market, what happens with the associated redispatch costs that are needed to serve that OAT contract? So we're going to need to have a further discussion, and we'll do that next week as part of the examples of how we can accommodate that redispatch. Next slide, please. So with that, what I'd like to go ahead and do is turn it over to James Lynn, who's a senior advisor in the Market Settlements Design Group, and he'll go through the Edam Transfer revenue discussion. So James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that. And I'm going to apologize in advance. Like Debbie, I have 2 dogs. Hopefully they behave, but I won't hold my breath. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to cover today is basically what is an Edam transfer, how is it going to be, in essence, set up in the market, and how it will transfer revenue will be calculated from this. And we're going to walk through examples of how the transfer revenue can be distributed to the appropriate transmission provider or customer. Under the current belief is the transfer revenue or congestion rents will be go to the BAA, and the BAA will distribute it based upon the terms of their oath. But this should give you a good idea of how we see that distribution potentially occurring and how we would set it up to facilitate that. And so as far as going through the transfer revenue, I have several examples. There's a spreadsheet that we posted on the website. There is 6 tabs. 3 of those tabs are designed to provide you with the background on how we came up with this decision to support our ISO BA pre-market mechanism for assigning ITC's congestion to CRRs. And that also goes into the pre-market mechanism where the ETSRs that are associated with the ISO that are a specific type those transfer revenues will be assigned directly back to the BAA that turned over rights to that transfer location. So let's get started on what is an Edam transfer. If you can go to the next slide. So I took this kind of from our tariff, but basically the Edam transfer, it's a transfer of energy, but this is actually going to be energy schedules between an Edam balancing authority area and either the ISO balancing authority area, or it's going to be a transfer between 2 Edam balancing authority areas. And we are using the transmission that had the capacity that had been made available by the Edam entity in order to facilitate these transfers. At each transfer location, we are anticipating that we will have 1 or more Edam transfer resource pairs established between the Edam BAAs or Edam BA and the ISO. These transfer resource pairs will facilitate the bucket 1, bucket 2, and bucket 3 transfer assessment and settlement or calculation of transfer revenue. As I go through the examples, I will demonstrate how these resources, ETSRs, are going to work, and you can distinguish between the 2 or 3 buckets depending upon how you establish these resource pairs. And then if at this point we're going to be assigning it to the congestion rents or the transfer revenue to the BAA, but as part of these transfer revenues, I will need to know what the total transmission capacity is, and if necessary, if there is an ETSR that is established with the transmission customer, I will need to know the association to the transmission provider or transmission customer as well. Can we go to the next slide? Now, when I refer to Edam transfers, there are 2 basic types. I refer to them as Edam Transfer 2 versus an Edam Transfer through. Now, Edam Transfer 2 location is where you need both BAA's transmission to get that energy through or to a specific location and then through the location. And a good example would be right now is most of the EIM BAAs have EIM transfer 2s. That means that if I have a transfer between, let's say, Pac West and Idaho, I need the transmission from Pac West and then the transmission from Idaho to determine how much is the available transmission that is really made available to the market in order to facilitate that transfer. So under this circumstances, it'll have a little bit different allocation of the transfer revenue than it will for a transfer location that's considered a transfer through. Now, a transfer through location is one where the Edm BAA that is turning over or providing available transmission to facilitate the transfer actually has rights to go to and through that transfer location to the other BAA. A lot of the ISO intertie locations are considered transfer are considered transfer through because we need the Edm BAA's transmission rights in order to facilitate the flow of energy from that balancing authority area to the ISO boundary. And in this discussion, this is where we'll talk a little bit about the treatment of transfer revenue for a transfer through going to the BAA and ITC to be considered internal congestion for the ISO. If we can go to the next slide. So what is transfer revenue? Transfer revenue is the difference in cost between the sum amounts of the export transfer resource and the import transfer resource at a specific transfer location. What it includes would be any differences in marginal cost of congestions between the LNPs, the marginal cost of energy differences, any marginal cost of loss differences, and then if it is applicable, and this is for bucket 3, if there is a hurdle rate that is needed to be determined or assessed in order to use that transmission. And we will address all those in the examples. So what will happen is we will distribute these pro rata to the BAAs based upon their available transmission capacity that they turned over. Now, this will be a little bit different when we talk about transfer to versus transfer through, but it'll be pretty easily to identify once we start walking through the examples. Next slide. And this is where we're going to go to the examples, but before I go to examples, I wanted to know if anybody had any quick questions on what is a transfer, what is a transfer, what is transfer resource, or what is transfer revenue? And if you can turn over to me so I can start sharing the presentation, that would be great.
James, at this time, we don't have any questions. Maybe could you just give an example? You gave an example of the transfer to as Pac West to Idaho. Could you give an example of a transfer through?
So a good example of a transfer through for the ISO would be Berlin. In order to facilitate those transfers, we need the rights of the BAAs to turn over available capacity to get the energy from that BAA to the Malin and through Malin into the ISO balancing authority area. Once it gets into the ISO balancing authority area, then internal transmission will be made available for finalizing that transfer. But the whole mechanism to do the transfer is needed the Edam BAA available transmission capacity in order to facilitate.
Okay, that's helpful. Kathleen Colbert, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vista. In the spirit of, I thought that was a great idea, Deb. The spirit of examples, as you were asking that and talking through it, is another example of a transfer through, kind of what I think of as the EIM transfers that flow through VPA, that like the rate of change constraint is applied on top of, but it's flowing through that to get to another Edam sink. that another example of what you would consider through?
So, and how we have modeled those is kind of like how I had described Malin. We have modeled those as separate transfers from the BAA to the, I think it's Malin is where they connect to the ISO. And so by modeling it as a transfer from, let's say, Puget Sound or Portland General to Malin, we are using their rights to get that energy through BPA to the boundary of California, Balancing Authority area at Malin. And so that would be a good example of a transfer through.
Great, thanks.
And that's the only question we have, James.
Okay. Now, I won't be able to see any chat questions or if anybody has their hand raised, so please let me know if a hand gets raised.
Yes, I will.
Now, this first example that we're going to walk through, I will set the example, but it is an example of a transfer too. This is between two Edm BAAs where the transfer location is somewhere between the two BAAs, and we need the transmission on both sides in order to facilitate the transfer of energy. In BAA, I have 3 transmission customers or providers that offer different amounts of available capacity. 200 would be, bucket 1 in essence. Transmission customer 2 could be bucket 1 or bucket 2. But TPA, which is providing 500 megawatts, this would be an example of bucket 3 where they put a hurdle rate to it. And this is a $5 hurdle rate. Now, when we establish ETSRs on the Edam Transfer resources, I need to be able to link these transmission providers to the transmission providers in bucket B or at BAB, which would be LSC1, TC2, TC3, or TB, and in order to facilitate the overall transfer of energy. Now, if you can see on lines or the box starting with Edm Transfer 1, what I established is a BAA hurdle-free transfer, which is ETSR1, is going to be established in a master file that links the transmission between LSC1, TC2 of BAA with the transmission associated with BAB that was considered a hurdle-free for LSC1, TC2, and TC3. This allows us to determine how much available capacity is able to be used as a hurdle-free rate. Under the circumstances, I have 500 megawatts of available capacity coming out of BAA, and then I have 700 available capacity to enter into or get the energy to BAB. Because we have to have a limit on the amount of energy we can send, we will do the lower of the 2 available transmission capacity. So in this case, this ETSR with a hurdle-free rate has the ability to send 500 megawatts of energy between BAA and BAB without having to take into consider any hurdle rate for any additional transfer. Edm Transfer 2 is the one that we would set up for the hurdle rate. Now, this is established with, in this case, it's TPA from BAA is going to be associated with TPB, transmission of BAB. Now, the TPA is offering 500 megawatts, whereas TPB is only offering 200 megawatts. So this ETSR is going to be limited to 200 megawatts of transfer. So if we start walking through the various scenarios, we are going to see how the transfer revenue is going to be calculated and distributed when you have different binding constraints. Under scenario 1, this one's the easiest. There is no binding constraints. I have 400 megawatts of transfer being made. It is not binding for ETSR1. So I don't have any congestion rents to allocate out. The pricing is the same. It's pretty straightforward and simple. In scenario 2, we start getting into binding constraints. Under scenario 2, I have reached the limit for ETSR 1. And so therefore, I will start seeing a price separation between the prices at BAB and BAA. BAB is willing to pay more energy or more money to have that energy transfer from BAA to resolve demand within its balancing authority area. So what this has created, and it'll be a form of either energy differentials or congestion differentials, is a price difference of $4. Now, based upon 500 megawatts of flow, I have a transfer revenue of $2,000. Now, since I didn't have a hurdle rate, the question is, how are we going to distribute that to the balancing authority areas? What we're going to use is the available transmission that was made to facilitate that transfer. Given this is a pretty straightforward example, it is going to be a 50-50 split because I need 500 megawatts from balancing authority area A to align with 500 megawatts of balancing authority area B in order to facilitate that transfer and not to cause harm to the balancing authority area. So what we'll do is we'll take those transmission capacity and pro-ratally distribute the transfer revenue to the balancing authority area. So it's if you can see in 13 and 14, it is BAA share is $1,000, BAB share is $1,000. And then what we're determining as a possible distribution is then take that $1,000 and distribute it down to the transmission customers that have provided the transmission to facilitate the transfer. In BAA, this would be $400 would go to LSE1, $600 to TC2, and then for BAB, it's going to be $400 to LSE1, $200 to TC2, and $400 to TC3. Based upon this, I fully have distributed the transfer revenue, and the customers that have provided that transmission are receiving the congestion rents for that transmission. Now, I'm going to go to the next scenario, and then I'll take quick questions if needed, and then I'll finish up with scenario 4 and 5. Scenario 3, we have now a situation where I need to transfer more than 500 megawatts. In this case, we're going to transfer 600 megawatts. We are able to do that because the price differential between BAB and BAA has exceeded or been equal to the hurdle rate that has been provided by TPA. And so then we will go through a similar mechanism for distributing the transfer revenue. In this case, I have 600 megawatts. The price differential is $5, so my transfer revenue is $3,000. However, since I have a specific transmission customer that has provided a hurdle rate of $5 to facilitate this transfer, I'm going to take off the top $500 or the 100 megawatts that's above the hurdle-free transfer, basically the amount of megawatts that is using that hurdle-free transmission, and distribute that directly to the transmission provider that has provided the hurdle-free rates. And then the $2,500 is going to be distributed pro rata to the transmission customers that have provided the hurdle-free rate. So since I didn't really want to get into what is bucket 1 and bucket 2, I, in essence, has created just basically 2 buckets. The first bucket, which is ETSR1, is the bucket with there is no hurdle rate associated with it. And then the bucket 2 would be, or in this case, bucket 3 is ETSR2, which is going to have a hurdle rate in order to facilitate the transfer.
Okay,
now,
James,
any questions?
Yes, we have a few questions. Jeffrey Nelson?
Hey, good morning. Can you all hear me? It's Jeff Nelson from SCE.
Yes,
Hi,
we
Jeff.
can.
Hey, good morning. First, thank you for providing examples like this. It's super helpful, so thank you. I want to talk about scenario 3 with the hurdle rate. And, I'm not quite sure I understand how the optimization works. I don't want to overspeak the language, but it seems like the transmission's becoming a decision variable. The transmission itself changes as a function of price. How does that work in the optimization? Because it seems like it can be unstable, that as soon as you release the additional transmission, the price differential might drop below the $5 that was needed to release the transmission.
So I don't know. I'll give a quick answer to this. I know George wants to add on to my answer. I'm happy to accept his expertise on the market optimization. But in essence, what's going to happen is as we're doing the market optimization and we are dispatching generation and to meet the load, we are going to get to a point where the marginal units between the two balancing authority area are indicating that the price differential has exceeded that hurdle-free rate. So the hurdle rate, sorry. And so at that point, we have now released additional transmission into the market optimization in order to facilitate any additional flow of energy between the two balancing authority areas. So once I've reached that level, going up the marginal unit that I'm above $5 under this scenario, I now have the ability to dispatch additional generation within BAA in order to serve load within BAAB. And it might have some modifications on the price, but we actually have to have the price differentials above that hurdle rate in order to utilize that transmission. George, if there's anything you want to add, please do.
Thank you, James. This is George Angelidis with the so just a little bit more clarity here. So the price on the transfer is really the result of the optimization of resource bids across the market footprint. And what happens is that the power balance constraint that is enforced for its BAA in the market footprint has the net transfer of that BAA as the mismatch, so to speak, right? So it's generation minus load results to a transfer. And that net transfer is distributed over the individual ETSRs that we have set up for this BAA with other BAAs. And in that distribution, the cost associated with its transfer is becoming relevant. So for bucket 1 and bucket 2 transmission, obviously there is no cost to use them, so the optimization will use these transfers first, and when these are exhausted, start hitting scheduling limits, then it will start using bucket 3 because it has a cost for using it. So in this example here, as the optimization finds a solution, in scenario 2, the scheduling limit on the ETSR1, which doesn't have the hurdle free, hits the limit, so you can only transfer 500 megawatts, that's the scheduling limit, and when that limit is hit, then you have price difference across the BAAs. Because essentially that constraint now separates the two markets in BAA and in BAAB. And for as long as this cost differential stays below $5, the ETSR2 is not used because it's not economic to use it. And in scenario 3, what happens is that the economics require additional transmission flow. So the ETSR2 will start being used, and that now will establish a $5 cost differential because of the usage fee. In the objective function, there is a term that is included with the cost of transmission, which is 0 for ETSR1, but $5 for ETSR2, and that's how you have, as a result, LMPs across the BAAs that show a $5 differential. Later on, when James is going to go to scenario 4, what happens, scenario 5, what happens there is that the scheduling limit on that ETSR2 now hits its limit. So now you potentially have a higher price differential above $5, and that is shown in the example as $7. So I hope this provides a little bit of an explanation about how these prices are formed in the market, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm going to just listen more and try to understand, because I still, one more quick follow-up question. Once we hit the $5 limit, is it an all or nothing transmission release? Do we get the whole quantity released to the market? Or is the optimization just, whittling away exactly the amount that's needed to maintain the $5 differential?
It's only using what is needed. You may not need to use the entire, what's the limit on the TSR to 200, I believe. So you will use, so you will use whatever you require to have the optimal solution. And even if you use 1 megawatt, that is sufficient to establish the $5 differential. So you can use all the way from 1 megawatt to 200. And as long as you're in that range, your price differential stays at $5. And if you hit that limit now on the 200 on the ETSR2, now potentially that price differential can go above the $5 usage fee.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have more questions maybe, but I'm going to let the conversation continue. Thank you. I'll keep listening.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Callie Wells, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. So actually, I have a follow-up question to the conversation that just took place and then a more detailed question. So the follow-up question, so did I understand that right, that once we get into the hurdle rate transfer capacity, the price separation between the two BAAs will stay at $5 for that whole 200 megawatt transfer, and then once it hits 201, for example, then the price differential will change? So there'll be kind of like an amount where the price differential will always be 5.
Yeah, so Callie, you will never go to 201 because that will violate the constraint. What you want to say is that the moment the ETSR2 starts having flow, non-zero flow, that establishes the $5 differential, and that stays for as long as the ETSR2 is used below its scheduling limit of 200 megawatts. When it hits 200 megawatts, then you could potentially have a higher price differential than the $5 usage fee. You can consider regular congestion that appears on ETSR1. You can say ETSR1 is the same situation, but the usage fee is $0. So as long as ETSR1 is used below its scheduling limit, the only price difference you see is the $0 usage fee. And when it hits its limit of $500, now you potentially see a price difference above the usage fee of 0, which is $4 in scenario 2. So similar with ETSR2, but now your usage fee is not 0, is $5. So that's your base when you start using it. Make sense?
Okay, that's what I thought I understood. I just wanted to confirm. So I guess my more detailed question, and I'll admit I actually pulled up the Excel file just to help myself walk through it as James kind of goes through these examples. So on the Excel file, when it sets the hurdle rate, I know this example only has one hurdle rate, but if the other is TPB also has a hurdle rate in there, let's say of $7, I'm assuming that the hurdle rate in the market will be the maximum of the two, not the summation of the two?
Actually, it'll be the summation of the two, and that was something I was going to do once I finished the 5 scenarios, and I can do it right now.
No, that's okay. If you're going to get to it, we can defer. It's fine.
No,
I noticed that.
Perfect timing, Kelly. It really is.
Okay.
So let's say TC. Go ahead.
We have a whole bunch of people in the queue, so maybe let's not go on to another example at this point and get through the queue.
Okay. Let's go through the queue then.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Ellen Wolf, you have a question? And I would note for everyone that the Excel spreadsheet was posted last night on the CAISO website for this working group.
Thanks, Deb.
Go ahead.
Ellen Wolf from Zero Consulting, and George's answers to Jeffrey's questions clarified a lot for me. I guess, am I right to assume this is sort of like the GHG bid price between BAAs and the EIM, where it's just another parameter with a cost function that will be entered by the transmission holder, and it gets optimized as you described? So correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then I have one other question.
Yeah, hello, this is George. So we don't envision this to be a bid like the greenhouse gas bid, which is submitted, hourly, because this is a regulated transmission rate. We would like to see it registered in the master file. I think it makes more sense than being submitted with a bid and changing every hour. So it will be like an attribute of the registration of this particular transfer, ETSR2.
Okay. All right, thanks. So my real question is on scenario 2, and you picked a price differential of $4. I imagine that was relatively arbitrary, but just to make sure I understand the basics, that $4 is coming from some sort of redispatch cost, I imagine, to balance these BAAs. And if I'm right about that, don't you, out of the transmission or the congestion rents, have to pay for that redispatch? And you don't have the whole $2,000 available to distribute to transmission rights holders?
So
that's a good question.
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, that's you see, this example focuses on what happens on the transfer. There's obviously resources in BAA and BAAB that are scheduled optimally, and what happens is resources in BAA are cheaper. They have lower bids than resources in BAAB, so that's why you're having a transfer from BAA to BAAB, right? And when that transfer hits the limit, all right, in scenario 2, which is 500 megawatts, now you have a price separation because the marginal resource in BAA is $4 lower than the marginal resource in BAAB. So you can have a price difference across the BAAs, which is $4, and that is reflecting here in the example as a price differential of $4. And because of this $4 difference, when you do the energy settlement for all the resources in BAA and BAAB, you collect congestion revenue essentially on ETSR1, which is $4 times the transfer of 2,000 megawatt schedule. So it's not different than your regular congestion that you have inside the BAA. It's a similar principle.
So, and I want to add on to that, George. And from a settlement perspective, what we are ending up doing is similar like we do with EIM. The market will clear the solve based upon the EDAM area, but when settlements does its settlements, we actually do it by BAA. So when I'm doing the settlement of energy for BAA, I'm going to settle all of the generation, load, imports and exports, and the ETSR associated with BAA. And then I'm going to do the same thing with BAB. What's missing here is now the fact that I had energy cost that was moving between the two balancing authority areas. That cost is not being distributed out to it, to any appropriate party. It's similar to our financial value ETSR calculations that we perform for EIM. But instead of doing as a financial value, we are actually going to settle this. So we're going to calculate that price differential based upon the transfer of energy, and then this money has to be distributed back to the two BAAs because we are now at that point fully accounting for any congestion rents or any congestion associated between the entire Edam BAA area. Or sorry, Edam area.
Okay, so I think you said, between what you said and George said, this $2,000 is sort of excess congestion rent available to use to compensate the transmission holders.
Correct.
And everybody, all the resource owners have been made whole already.
Correct.
Okay, thanks. That helps. Thank you very much.
Great. Kathleen, you have another question?
Yeah, sure thing. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have, and maybe this is probably taking this back a little bit higher and simpler, so apologies, but I wanted to just ask you a really simple question about the construction of the examples for the EIM Transfer 1 and EIM Transfer 2 that you have in the, over to the far left, rows 16 through 31. I'm trying to work my mind through relating the bucket discussions we've been having with these, with your example. And I was wondering, whichever way you think is best to kind of maybe help walk through that. Can you do that one more time? Which buckets maybe are associated with each row? Yeah.
Okay, so the easy part is bucket 3 is ETSR 2. Because we have a hurdle rate that is needed to be accounted for before we can use that transmission. Because we have continuing discussions on what is considered bucket 1 and bucket 2, I lumped the two together as a hurdle-free transmission that is going to be solved by the market. And so ETSR 1 is a combination of bucket 1 transmission and bucket 2 transmission. I don't know if you remember George's presentation. The BAAs can establish this in two ways. They can establish ETSRs for each bucket, or if they are alike in mind and we are going to be giving the transfer revenue to the BAA to distribute, they can lump the two buckets together if it has a hurdle-free rate or if it has a hurdle rate. They can put them into specific ETSRs that account for those attributes, and then we will, from a settlements perspective, I will calculate it and settle it as if they are just a resource to me. I don't necessarily need to know if it's bucket 1 or bucket 2, but I do need to distinguish between bucket 3 and then the other buckets. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And thanks for going through that and keeping it simple. I super appreciate it. Yeah, I maybe just one follow-up just to make sure I understand your example here. I kind of was reading into it, and if this was reading too far, that the row 18, like LSE1, which relates to 21, also I would think of as kind of your bucket 1 equivalent, and that you were kind of using transmission customer 2 and 3 as kind of proxies for if bucket 2 were in there, or am I taking too far of a leap?
No, that is in essence what I was doing.
Okay. Okay. No, great. Thank you so much for talking through it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks. Don Trethway, you have a question?
Yeah. So thanks for introducing finally the discussion about how to distribute the congestion rent, because I think that'll actually help illuminate the transmission that's made available as well. But one thing I do want to ask is more of a foundational question. There's this presumption that the congestion needs to be determined by each balancing authority area in the EDAM. In the energy imbalance market, that makes sense because there's base schedules, and to the extent that there's unresolved congestion in those base schedules, it results in the real-time congestion offset, which is an uplift, and you wouldn't want to distribute those uplift costs to other balancing authority areas that are in the EIM simply because some EIM entity had unresolved congestion. When we move to the day-ahead time frame, we're talking about an overcollection of congestion, and we need to try to get it back to the correct load-serving entity that has either purchased the transmission customer. And in that mindset, it's really how do you get the LSE covered based upon their source and their sink based upon the transmission that they purchased, independent of which balancing authority area the leg is in. And so I would just wonder why, is this a necessary to have the congestion rents go back to the individual balancing authority area? Is there some principle that's made that presumption, or is that something that could be reconsidered?
So I'm going to answer this is a starting point, and in these working group, these type of topics are always open for discussion. But prior to the kickoff of the working group, the entities had some discussions on how this would work, and this was the starting point where we wanted to address this. And during the working group discussions, we can potentially pivot off of it, but that is going to have to go through the working group discussions. Now, to help with that type of design is when we establish, and the person who is establishing the ETSRs are the BAAs. They could establish an ETSR for just LSE1 that would be explicitly set up so that we calculate transmission revenue for LSE1 going from BAA to BAB, and then another transfer revenue for TC2. That would allow for the ability to distinguish between the transfer revenue of the two buckets, and then, if necessary, the allocation to the appropriate customer, whether it's load or a separate transmission customer. But that is going to be during the design or the development of the ETSR pairs.
Right, but if the load serving entity was awarded, a congestion revenue right with the source and a sink, wouldn't the price differential in the congestion component of that compensate them directly for both any transmission internal to the balancing authority area as well as the transfer costs?
So I'm only addressing the transfer revenue and not the internal transmission. We will discuss that further in other topics, because we're getting into, George already presented it about having ETCs and TORs. There is potentially the ability to link it all the way from an ETC TOR, all the way from the source and sink that are crossing balancing authority area. But that is potentially a future discussion, and I wanted to not have that discussion under this particular paradigm.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're trying to keep this discussion just to the transfers. Tong Wu, you have a question? And could you please?
Yes. Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Hello,
Okay. Hi, James. I have two comments. James, you let me know if I misunderstood. My first comment is about bucket 1 and bucket 2. I think you're lumping bucket 1 and bucket 2 together using the same congestion rent allocation methods. I think these two needs to be considered separately, because for bucket 1, the LSEs will have to bring transmission to show resource sufficiency. When they bring transmission into the market, basically they donate that market to share with everybody. So for bucket 1, I kind of agree your proposal how to allocate congestion. Basically, it goes back to the load. For bucket 2, I believe this is the transmission that people voluntarily put in the market. It's not a part of their RSE showing, not necessarily. And because of that, the right holder who bring the transmission to the table should get the congestion rent, not socialized with all the loads and equally divided into two different BAs. It should go to who brought this transmission to the table. So that's my first comment. My second comment was about bucket 2 and bucket 3. I think the congestion rent allocation should be consistent between bucket 2 and bucket 3. I really think bucket 2 is a special case of bucket 3 when the transmission hurdle rate is 0. Basically, from optimization point of view, you optimize the cost of the transmission, and if there is a hurdle rate, you call it a hurdle rate, you could think of it as a bid price. Although it's submitted through the master file, that's just a mechanism of submission and a way to limit the bid cap. That's how I think about it. So it's really, from optimization point of view, it is a bid. When you optimize this, the bid is 0 for bucket 2 and a non-zero for bucket 3. So if you treat them consistently, bucket 3 should get congestion rent as well. If you strip out the rate, the hurdle rate, and you just pay the transmission provider the rate, and then leave the additional congestion rent to somebody else, and then you're not treating bucket 2 and bucket 3 logically consistently. So those are my two comments.
Okay. So regarding your first comment is from a settlement perspective, or an ETSR established for bucket 1, bucket 2, or bucket 3 is not going to be something that, in essence, the settlement needs to know. What we need to know, particularly the transfer revenue, is whether or not it's a hurdle-free rate or a hurdle rate. How that is established and who gets the distribution of that will be performed while we're creating the ETSRs. If we wanted to separate it out and have a specific ETSR that is associated with a transmission customer, then that could be something that can be performed, and then we'll have an association to that ETSR, and therefore the congestion rents would go directly back to that transmission customer. What I'm trying to demonstrate here on a fundamental level is how a hurdle-free rate transfer revenue is distributed versus a hurdle rate transfer revenue is distributed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Question from Doug Boccignoni.
Hi, Doug Boccignoni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Actually, sort of two comments. For most of this discussion, we've been using the term congestion rents. I think, James, when you started talking about the examples, you were also referring to, the other components, energy, marginal losses. And is it right that what we're describing here is really all of the above? It's not just marginal cost of congestion differences between
Correct.
the BAAs.
It is all the above. Right now, when we talk about people are using congestion rents and transfer revenue as synonymous because of how we have established the Edm transfers, where the power balance constraint is embedded within the congestion. I'm using the word transfer revenue if that ever gets separated. And so when I'm saying transfer revenue, it incorporates any differences between the two LMPs.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then if I'm understanding the way the bucket 3 is being settled, it looks like once the hurdle rate is met, 100% of the value goes to the source BAA. Is that?
Yeah, the proposal right now is, or the proposal, the example right now is that if we are using that transmission in which there is a hurdle rate, the price differential for those megawatts, that particular transmission, it needs to be distributed to the customers who have provided the hurdle rate transmission.
Okay. The part that's kind of confusing to me is, I mean, you could have a hurdle rate of, you know, 1,000th of a cent and, you know, call it bucket 3 transmission and get all the value. And, you know, it just seems kind of strange to me.
And we can, and that could be some additional discussions. But we have to make sure that the transmission customer who's providing that transmission, at least their hurdle rate compensation is covered. I think what you want to discuss more is in scenario 5, is when we've exceeded that hurdle rate and you have additional congestion. How is that being distributed?
Exactly.
So, and that's what we'll move on to after doing scenario 4, and then I'll move to scenario 5.
Okay, thank you.
And that's an excellent segue. James, go ahead and go on to scenario 4 and 5.
Okay, scenario 4 is very similar to scenario 3. It's more of a bridge between scenario 3 and scenario 5. In essence, we are getting close to the constraint of the ETSR2 and what is the distribution going to be. And as you can see, it's very similar to scenario 3. In essence, is going to pay the hurdle rate for their portion first, and then any leftover transfer revenue is going to be distributed among the hurdle-free transmission. Now, scenario 5 is where we're starting to get into these discussions, and this is where it's designed to facilitate some of the discussions. I now have reached the limit for both ETSR1 and ETSR2. So now I'm at 700 megawatts. My price differential is exceeding the $5 because we now are constrained at the scheduling limit, and it has now become $7. So the question then is, how are we distributing the $4,900 that is associated with the transfer revenue of 700 megawatts from BAA to BAB? Now, what we are doing right now is for that transmission that is above the hurdle free rate, it's 200 megawatts times the $2 differential between, or so 700 megawatts times the $2 differential is going to TPA, and that is going to be to cover its hurdle rate. I think that's what. So 700 megawatts times the $7 minus $5, and then you get the $1,400, which is then paid to the TPA. And then everything else is being distributed to all the hurdle-free customers or transmission customers based upon their available transmission. So I think this is where we need to have this discussion as to, eventually have discussion is how is this, once we ensure that the transmission customer that provided the hurdle rate is fully compensated, is what happens with the additional money? Does it go to them because we are using their 200 megawatts of transmission, or is it should be distributed pro rata to everybody? And the current thought is that the money would go to the hurdle rate, and then the balance would go to everybody else. Now, I'm going to make a small change. This goes back to Callie's question. Now, I set it up as a one customer providing a hurdle rate, but if the ETSR basically has TPA having a hurdle rate of $3 and TPB saying I want to get at least compensated $2, I'm still going to have my hurdle rate for this full transfer is $5. And you can see that in D31. We will not use that transmission until until we have exceeded the sum of those two hurdle rates and not a max or min, because when I do the distribution of the transfer revenue to the hurdle rate, I need to be able to take the $5 differential and distribute it to 300 to 200 to both customers so that they are compensated for both of their hurdle rates. So now I will leave it open for next series of questions.
Tom, you have a question? Well, actually, George, did you want to expand on that before we go to questions?
Hi. Actually, I have a question too. I'm looking here at the numbers. So TPA releases 500 megawatts under a usage fee, which used to be $5 in your example before you changed it, James. I'm looking at the transfer revenue that TPA receives, and I was expecting in scenario 3, for example.
Where'd you go, George?
We lost you.
So that's that the right is used, but I see $3,000 instead of $2,500. And similarly for scenario 5, I would expect, and this is part of the discussion I guess we're going to have, I would expect that there is a price difference of $7. They should receive $500 worth of that, so I would expect something different than $4,900. And maybe I'm not understanding this part of the exam, but this was my expectation.
The total transfer revenue is $4,900. So it's $7 times the 700 megawatts. Now we're going to distribute that $4,900 into that portion which is associated with the hurdle rate and that portion which is the overall transfer revenue that has to be distributed out. Now, let me go back to the 5 and 5, or 5 and 0, make it easier. So what we're doing here is I'm taking I have to determine how many megawatts are using the hurdle rate. So that's 200 megawatts, okay? And that 200 megawatts is then multiplied by the $7 price differential, and that is going to be distributed to the transmission customer that provided the hurdle rate transmission. And then anything left over is going to be distributed to the hurdle free. That is how it is being. The original discussions was how we should do that distribution. The question I think you're trying to, or you're getting at is, should it be limited to the $5 and should be the $2 be distributed to everybody? I think that is that is where we need to have that discussion. Am I understanding your question correctly?
George? Are you on mute?
Yes, I was. James, can you go to scenario 3, which is a little bit simpler because you don't have this situation. You have like,
sure.
So there you have a $5 transfer cost, and the TPA, actually the ETSR2 is only 200 megawatts, right? Because it has to connect through, right? So
right now, we're using 100 megawatts.
Is it 100 or 200? Because TPA releases 500, connects with TPB, which is 200, so it's 200 through, right?
Yeah, that's the available transmission capacity. And based upon this scenario 3, we're using 100 of that available capacity.
Oh, okay. So that's how you get the 500 there. Okay.
Correct.
And similarly, that's how you get the 1400 in scenario 5, because the use of ETSR2 is the entire 200.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I'm good. Yeah, I was. I guess I was having a moment. It makes sense for me now. Thank you.
Well, and part of it is once I switched it to the 2 hurdle rates, it makes it a little bit more confusing. But yes, I understand.
Okay. All right. Question from Tom?
Yeah. I think my earlier question were ahead of the scenario 5. I hope that I am communicating accurately or clearly with James.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking that the transmission, since is a variable that is being optimized, it has a equivalent LMP, just like a generator. If you have a generator, it has a bid on it, there will be a LMP on it. And for bucket 3, this transmission is optimized. So it has a LMP for that transmission. I think that should be used to pay for the transmission. There is no allocation issue. And
so
yeah.
To answer that question, Tom, is we are using LMPs. The LMP is going to be the export from the one balancing authority area associated with the import into the other balancing authority area. This addresses the use of that transmission in order to provide the energy transfer. So when you're exporting from BAA, you are being charged at $25, or that transmission is being charged for $25. And when it's importing into that the other BA, it's being paid at $32. This is a $7 price differential. Well, that is the congestion rents, or in essence, the transfer revenue in reality is what I'm referring to it as, that needs to be distributed to either the BAA or the transmission customer. In this case, I have a combination of a hurdle-free transmission as well as a hurdle rate transmission. Of this $7, I'm going to distribute it first to the hurdle rate transmission, only for that portion of transmission which was used at the hurdle rate, and then any additional congestion is going to be distributed to all the hurdle-free transmission customers. So there is the use of LMPs. It's just we are using the LM. It's a similar of having a wheel through in essence through a BA. I'm going to charge you for importing, or pay you for importing and charge you for exporting, and the price differential is what the energy and the transmission is being paid for. But this is between two BAs.
Yeah, I think that this is the area that's not very clear, but principle would be the same. So here you're saying that you're not using the shadow price for that transmission constraint to pay that transmission. You're using the difference of two nodal prices. Now,
yes.
If you model the system by a pair of counterflow and enforce a market separation constraint, ISO used to have that. You enforce that this pair to be equal, and then you could derive the price difference for this constraint. But I believe you're gonna just model that hurdle rate for that transmission itself, not as a pair of counterflow injections. So there might be some discrepancies. But the principle, I think, is that the transmission in bucket 3 should be paid the full LMP, not a part of it. Basically, it should not be paid as bid. It should be paid as the marginal price, because you pay bucket 2 at the marginal price. But why do you treat them separately? If you pay bucket 2 the marginal price, and then you should pay bucket 3 the marginal price as well. And bucket 3 should not be disadvantaged in comparison with bucket 2. The hurdle rate should be a floor. It's like for generators, this would be equivalent to make whole payment or the bid price. You're not going to pay a generator below their bid. So for this bucket 3 transmission, you should pay the transmission at least its bid, although the bid is submitted through the master file, not through Cyber, but it's the concept is the same. You should not pay the transmission pay as bid.
Okay. So
I hope my message is clear. You may disagree, but I hope we're communicating and you understand what I'm trying to say.
I am understanding what you're saying, Tom, and I believe we are doing that. And for example, scenario 5 is a good example of that. In your reference here, the $5 would in essence be the bid. The marginal differences between the import and export location is $7. So the transmission that has been provided at the hurdle rate is being compensated at $7, not $5. So you are getting the marginal cost differentials between the export location of the ETSRs and the import location of the ETSRs. So you are getting the marginal cost differentials.
Okay, and the transmission owner will get this. So this is not socialized with the load customer that use the transmission, right?
That is how we establish the association to that ETSR will determine how the transmission customer gets it.
Okay.
I'm being very vague there because it could be that the BAA passes that direct through. I allocate to the BAA and the BAA passes it through using that ETSR, or it could be a direct allocation from the ISO settlement system. That is going to be dependent upon how we establish that ETSR and the rules that we have associated with paying that ETSR.
Mm-hmm. So because we're talking about interties, so this transmission is links two different BAs. Which BA do you give this to then? If you don't know, which BA is has the transmission owner for this transmission.
Based upon the setup in master file, we have established that the $5 belongs on the exporting BAA because the two BAs have an agreement that the exporting BAA hurdle rate needs to be covered and the importing BAA it does not have a hurdle rate. In my example where I change this $5 to $3 and $2, I still have a $5 hurdle rate that has to be covered, and the distribution of that $1,400 is between the two balancing authority areas based upon the fact that I had to cover both the hurdle rate of the exporting BA as well as the hurdle rate of the importing BA. And that hurdle rate distribution determines which BAA or which customer gets those costs or those transfer revenues.
I think it should be distributed between the two BAs according to the ownership of the transmission, not based on whether it's an importing or exporting BA.
It is, but if you look at it, so this TPA has 500 megawatts that's offering to facilitate the transfer. TPB has 200, so I can only distribute 200. So it's going, if there is a different distribution set up in master file that says this $5 should be distributed differently than $3 and $2, then we will facilitate it that way. But if I'm assuming that everything's equal, you both turned over in essence 200 megawatts of transmission that I can use at a $5 hurdle rate, then I'm going to distribute based pro rata on that 200 megawatt transmission. So that's in essence a 50-50 split times your hurdle rate.
I see.
So now
I see.
So that changes a little bit. It now becomes more of a 60-40 split.
Okay. So you rely on the two BAs to figure out who has the ownership, what percentage of ownership of the transmission that they have.
Correct.
Yeah. So you do not explicitly record somewhere in the ISO system to know, from transmission point of view, who has the ownership. You rely on the two BAs to figure that out, coordinate.
Well, the two BAs will set up the ETSRs from the initial setup of the Edam BA if there is changes in the ownership. And that's where the discussion has to come, is whether or not it's the ISO that is distributing directly to the customers, or if it's going to be the BAA doing that distribution. And I'm demonstrating here how it would happen if either parties did that distribution using this particular methodology.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Steve.
Question from Stephen Pruitt.
Yeah, Stephen Pruitt, Los Angeles. James, thanks for doing this. This is really great to look at and go through. My question is mainly about understanding the principles presented here in scenario 5 particularly. When you're using the $7 for the price differential in calculating the amount going to the transmission that's contributing, the hurdle rate transmission that's contributing to the overall transfer, is it correct to say that the question here is, in my mind, and I'd like to know if this is correct, are we wanting hurdle rate transmission to participate and have a share of the value that is created in the transfer, as opposed to simply making it whole and paying its rate at $5?
That is the discussion. And the principle right now is that because we have a price differential that is greater than the hurdle rate, that the use of that transmission, they should be able to receive the full marginal differences between the two prices, the marginal differences for using that transmission. And then for the hurdle free, they will get their portion of the hurdle free times that same transmission differential. Mm-hmm. And now, whether or not there is discussions that have to occur that we only compensate up to the hurdle rate and then anything above that is distributed among everybody, that is something that can be discussed during the working group. But the current principle is that because we're using their transmission, they should get the full marginal differences.
Okay. In other words, they're not treated as just a utility that is paid to facilitate a transfer. They are part of the value transaction.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do we have any other questions at this point? James, there are more tabs to this. Do you have more examples?
More tabs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So example 2, we start getting into, and a lot of these are stair-step examples. Example 2 is an example of the wheel through. And in this case, as I said, ISO is a good example of having a wheel through. Because at that point, you're going to have to take into consideration also the ITC limit and ITC congestion. So what we've created in this scenario is 3 BAAs, Edam BAA, BAB is in essence the ISO in this example, where the transmission is being provided by BAA and BAC to get the energy to BAB. We have established 4 different ETSRs. We're mainly going to focus on these discussions on hurdle free. I didn't want to, given the confusion we had, or the lengthy discussion on the hurdle rate, I wanted to keep this simple so that we can address the transfer revenue and then eventually the ITC congestion. In the establishment of a transfer between BAA to BAB, the LSE1 is providing, or BAA is providing 400 megawatts of transmission to get to the boundary of BAB. BAC is providing 600 megawatts of transmission to get to BAB, and BAB has a scheduling limit of 700 megawatts. So that means between the three BAAs, BAB can only receive a maximum amount of transfer capability of 700 megawatts. And so when we do the available transmission limits, it's going to be the comparison of each ETSR in relationship to the availability to deliver it to that balancing authority area at a whole. So for ETSR 1, it's 400 megawatts as compared to 700 megawatts. So the limit for ETSR 1 is 400 megawatts. For ETSR 2, it's going to be a 600 megawatts versus 700 megawatts. So it's a transfer limit of 600 megawatts. So I have 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability that is going to be limited by BAB's ability to accept that at 700. So now when we run the market is going to optimize it to determine what is the best flow of energy between the two balancing authority areas. And in this scenario, we're at a limit of 400 megawatts in scenario 2. To make this simple, we make the assumption that all of this energy is coming from BAA and not BAC. Now, it will get more complicated as we start going into the fact that it's going to be distributed, but the concept is the same. So I will calculate a transfer revenue of $1,600, and then based upon using ETSR 1 as to facilitate this transfer, because if you look, I put under we have reached the limit of BAA1, which means we have done the full 400 coming from BAA, sorry. And so that this transfer revenue is distributed between BAA and BAB. And I didn't go into the distribution below, but it's pretty simple. The LSD1 is going to get the full $800 in BAA, and BAB is going to be distributed among the participants in BAB. And now we start addressing what happens in relationship to the ETSR. Now, we are going to have now a 700 megawatt distribution, which means, oh, I've got to fix something here, come to think of it. Oh, no, I'm good. So, sorry, I had to look at the pricing. So, because we are bound at ETSR 1, I'm going to have a price differential between BAB and BAA, because BAC is not bound. I'm going to not have a price differential between BAB, BAC, with the exception of now that I'm at the ITC limit. And this is what we're trying to demonstrate here, is that the 300 megawatts of flow going from BAC to BAB is all being priced at $29, and the $2 differential between BAA and BAC is considered ITC shadow price constraint being violated or being constrained. And so now that we have a constraint at the ITC, there is 3 discussions that occurred as to how we want to distribute this. Do we want to do a share of the distribution of the ETSRs and the ITC? Do we want to have a share of the ETSR but limit the ITC to the BAA which it resides? And then no sharing of either the ITC and the ETSR. Now, this was discussed significantly prior to the kickoff of Edam. And because the CRRs, the ISO has about a mechanism in which the CRRs are being distributed based on congestion as quoted ITC. The agreement or the belief is that scenario 3C is the appropriate way to handle it. But in the next set of examples, we're going to walk through how we came to that. But I just wanted to provide a quick high level of how the distribution would be if we use each of these scenarios, with the understanding that the belief that the most optimal solution is scenario C. So under scenario A, I have transfer revenue of $1,600. That's the 400 megawatts between BAA to BAB. There's a price differential of...
Perry, you have a question while we're working through this?
Yeah, I thought it'd be good to just get a clarification on the first tab of the spreadsheet. I think the spreadsheet you all published yesterday has a correction that you showed in the WebEx, but that is not in the published spreadsheet. I just want to know which one's right. And I think it's just a question of the summing of the hurdle-free megawatts in column or in cell B20 on the first tab. Just wanted to point that out. You guys are presenting 500 megawatts there, but the summation in the published spreadsheet is 700. I just want to know which ones. Seems to me it should be the 500 that you're presenting now, but just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, we'll republish the spreadsheet again. I know James was still working on the spreadsheet when we put it out last night, and he probably went ahead and found an error and corrected it in what he's presenting now.
Okay. And it looks like...
Hey, Perry, this is George.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're talking about scenario 3, which we were just talking about, in scenario 3, you have a total 700 megawatt of transfer in, which is bound by the binding ITC, okay, which is limited to 700. And 400 out of that is coming through ETSR1, which is at scheduling limit, so that one is also binding. And the other 300 through ETSR2, which is not binding. That's the setup, okay?
Yeah, that makes sense on example 2. I was just going back to example, the tab for example 1, but I think if you guys are going to republish the spreadsheet, that's good enough.
Hello, everybody.
That makes sense.
There?
Yes. Yay, you're back.
Okay.
I went through the whole presentation before I realized I wasn't on. So, I came in when you guys were discussing something about 700 versus 500, and there's a difference between what we published versus what I'm showing here.
Correct.
Okay, so we'll have to republish it. I don't remember making changes, but I very easily could have. Updates. I've gone through this spreadsheet probably 15 times, making minor adjustments to account for all the energy and all the revenue. So I can republish it easily. Now, I don't know where I got cut off.
Okay, so let's give you publishing rights back to your document.
Okay. Which is funny because it still showed me presenting. That's why I was confused.
Yeah. What ended up happening is we saw all sorts of things on your computer, so we overrode you.
As I was trying to get back in? Okay.
Yeah. So where you left off is actually the cell N7 was where you left off in the discussion in scenario 2.
Okay, so
what we'll do is we'll go ahead and finish up scenario 2 because we'll run out of time by about then, and then go ahead and pick this up next Thursday.
Okay.
And go to this first.
Go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, so so what we've determined here, and this is why I put in these tabs, that ETSR 1 is binding. So what that means is, based on the market optimization, this full 400 megawatts is coming from BAA. Now, this is we did this just to simplify some of the discussion. So ETSR 1 is binding, ETSR 2 is not binding, and the ITC is not binding. What that means is basically I have 400 megawatts coming from BAA to BAB. I'm at the limit of BAA, so I have a price separation between BAA and BAB. And so from that price separation, it's $29 versus $25, I'm going to calculate transfer revenue of $1,600. That's a $4 price differential times the 400 megawatts that is being transferred. This transfer revenue is being distributed under this scenario as 50-50. Now, we will get to eventually scenario 3C, where we believe that this may not be the optimal distribution of this transfer revenue, but I will work my way through there. Now, this uses the same mechanism that we did for, or same thought process that we did for wheel 2. It's a transmission is 400 distributed. Okay, so now that we have a baseline, we have some discussions on, is that appropriate? Because the transmission provider is providing the energy all the way to the boundary of BAB, should we be distributing the transfer dollars revenue to both BAAs, or should it be to the BAA that's providing that transmission? We also are going to introduce these concepts of the ITC limit being constrained and the shadow price of the ITC and how we distribute that. So we'll start out with scenario 3A, which goes to scenario 3B, and eventually the optimal solution we think is the way to handle this is scenario 3C, but we will walk through later on, and that's tabs 4, 5, and 6, how we came to that conclusion, but I wanted to just introduce it now here. So in scenario 3A, we are sharing the ETSRs and we're sharing the ITC. We have determined that the Itc Shadow Price is $2, which means the energy price to get to Balancing Authority Area B is $29. And that's because the cost from energy going from BAC to BAB is $29. It's not binding, so I don't have any additional limits that I'm violating, and therefore the cost of energy to get the Balancing Authority Area B is $29. So having that as a baseline, that means the transfer revenue between BAA and BAB is going to remain that $4 price differential. So that means I have $1,600 of transfer revenue that needs to be distributed between the two Balancing Authority areas. And the reason why I'm saying two Balancing Authority areas, again, is because we did not calculate any transfer revenue from the flow of energy from BAC to BAB. So the distribution of that $1,600 would be $800 and $800 to BAA and BAB. Now we come to the ITC Shadow Price. The ITC Shadow Price is $2. Well, that is based upon a limit at the BAB boundary. Now, if we're sharing this, It's going to be $1,400. That $1,400 is going to be distributed to each of the balancing authority areas based upon their used transmission, not just the available transmission, but the used transmission. This would be 400 megawatts coming from BAA, 300 megawatts from BAC, and then the 700 megawatts within BAB. So that distributes as $1,400 into 400, 700, and 300, respectively. So what that means for a total is BAA is being compensated for $1,200, BAB is being compensated for $1,500, BAC is compensated for $300. Now, if we look at this and we made the determination, because the ISO has a pre-established mechanism via CRRs to distribute the ITC to CRR holders, then that predicates that we should not be distributing the ITC equally. So that would be scenario 3B. In this scenario 3B, we are having it where it's still the 50-50 split for the transfer revenue from BAA to BAB. And then the ITC congestion, which is an internal congestion to BAB, is going to stay within BAB, and that's going to be distributed to CRRs. So that changes the totals. Now, BAA gets paid $800, BAB gets $2,200. Now BAC doesn't have anything because it didn't contribute to the transfer revenue. Now, if we take it another step further, well, the only reason why the transfer was able to occur is because BAB and BAC provided the transmission to the boundary of BAB. So 3C seems to be the most optimal solution, where we don't share the ITC and we don't share the ETSR. In essence, the ETSR then the transfer revenue associated with ETSR belongs to the balancing authority area that provides that transmission. So in scenario 3C, the $1,600 is now being distributed to BAA. There is no distribution of transfer revenue to BAB or BAC. And then the ITC, because it's internal constraint within BAB, is then distributed to BAB, which is then divvied out through CRRs. So what this results in is BAA gets a full transfer revenue of $1,600. BAB is allocated the ITC congestion of $1,400, and BAC does not get anything because it did not have any transfer revenue between the two balancing authority areas. If there was some transfer revenue, then BAC would get their portion of that transfer revenue. Now, hopefully I stayed connected. Any questions?
Deb, you are muted, by the way.
I was worried there, guys. I thought I got disconnected again.
Jeff Spires, you have a question? Jeff, are you
Jeff,
muted?
You may be muted, Jeff.
Jeff, go ahead and
Can you hear me
unmute your
now?
line.
How's that?
Hi, Jeff. There it is.
Sorry about that. Apologies. Hi, James. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for putting forward the examples with numbers behind them. I think this is very helpful to understand what the outcomes would be based on different assumptions. This is more just a comment, I think, for next time, which is I think that, you know, before we go too far, you mentioned a few times that from the CAISO's point of view, 3C is the most optimal outcome. And I think that suggestion is different from my understanding of what the proposal would be for how congestion rent is allocated between other BAs that don't include the CAISO, which I think is more comparable with scenario 3A. And so I think that differential between either splitting the congestion on a multi-segment transfer path 50-50 between the two entities that are contributing the transmission versus what I understand 3C to represent, which is more along the lines of whichever side is deemed to have filled first receives 100% of the congestion value. I think understanding why that's the proposal and why you arrived at that conclusion that you think 3C is appropriate is a conversation we need to have, because I'm not following the logic there, and would like to understand what the thinking is that would lead you to that conclusion.
Okay. Now, I want to add something to, go ahead. Debbie.
I was good, and we'll have that discussion follow up next week.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I want to provide some clarifying clarifications to your comments, Jeff. This isn't an ISO proposal. This was an agreement that was reached between the entities when they were developing the principles. And I'm just presenting the agreement or the starting point that they reached in that discussion. So we will have those discussions, as Debbie said, next Thursday. But again, I just want to be very clear. This isn't an ISO viewpoint. This was the viewpoint of the entities that came up with the principles.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kathleen, quick question. We only have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, super quick. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I actually just wanted to thank the CAISO and James for putting this forward. This spreadsheet is great. It's an awesome tool for us to take back. I just really wanted to give some acknowledgement and thanks, and appreciate the chance to work through this. I heard you mention that I know we're on a tight schedule, but if we could keep going through these examples, that would be great at kind of the next meeting if we can make time for it. Thank you.
That's what we're planning on doing. So the next meeting of Working Group 2 is next Thursday at 9 to 11, and we'll continue on these examples and see if we can integrate them with the other information that we've been working on for you. And with that, we'll call it a day for today. Thanks so much for everyone's participation. Greatly appreciate it. And event producer will go ahead and close the meeting.
Thank you, everybody.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.